Testing. Can you hear me now?
Yep, not too far, I guess, maybe 20 or so miles.
Yep. Maybe even a few less, but okay. It's straight up 12 noon, and I'd like to welcome everybody to the I-29 dairy webinar. We are excited to have everybody here. Fortunately, we didn't have to brave a lot of snow to get to the webinar. We got a couple of things just to kind of remind everybody. Looks like a fairly small group, but if you will stay muted, that'll eliminate background noise. And then once we open it up for questions, you can unmute or go to the chat box and put your questions in. And we've got a couple people who'll be monitoring that. In about 3 days after we get the program archived, I will send you an email that will give the archive address, as well as ask you to participate in an evaluation for these programs. It's important for us to know what we're doing well as what needs to be improved. So we would sure appreciate you filling that evaluation out. Our program today is producing high quality forage in a stressful season, and our presenter is Leah Ten Napel. She is the new extension agronomist for Northwest Iowa. Leah grew up in Lamar's and graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in agronomy and seed science. Before coming to Extension, she worked in industry for several years, and we were delighted when we were able to convert her and get her to our Extension group. So, Leah, the podium is yours.
Perfect. Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys today. I definitely got to do a lot of research when it came to this presentation, because I do know a lot about corn, but not so much about dairy. So a lot of research went into putting this together. So I really hope that throughout the presentation, we have time at the end for questions. Not only questions, but then also discussion would be great, because I just love to learn more about the dairy industry locally and what you guys saw these past couple of years in these drought conditions. So I will get started with that. Today we are going to talk about a couple of the reminders to keep in mind when we're growing high quality silage. We're also going to talk about what drought conditions really did to our silage or can do to our silage, some things we can do to get ahead of that. And then just some discussion time and maybe some alternatives to corn silage. All right, so there's a handful of key practices that we want to remember when we are growing quality corn silage. And first is moisture content. We also want to remember to keep in mind the kernel processing and chop length. We want to talk a little bit today about inoculants and how those can help us. Then we're going to touch on packing and sealing and covering to make sure that silage stays good. So first of all, we'll hit on the moisture content. So a little reminder of where the nutritional value of the silage for our dairy cows comes from. When the corn kernel stores energy, it is in the form of a sugar or carbohydrate called starch. So this sugar is utilized by the microbes in a cow's rumen, and is a rich source of energy. When the microbes utilize or ferment these sugars, they produce VAF, which is a volatile fatty acid, and these fuel the cow's metabolism. The production of corn silage is a result of a fermentation process that pickles the forage and makes it stable as long as it is not exposed to oxygen. And as you guys all know, corn silage is the base of many of our dairy rations, so it's really important that we keep that product as high quality as possible. Now, touching on the moisture content, when we're harvesting a crop too wet, it often results in undesirable fermentation and possible nutrient loss if there's any seepage of that silage. When the forage is ensiled too dry, it can be difficult to pack, and that allows oxygen in. So that also results in nutrient loss and spoilage. Therefore, we need to make sure we are harvesting at the correct moisture content. And the optimal moisture can depend on different storage techniques, but as a rule of thumb, we can say around 35% dry matter, 65% moisture, or around that 3/4 milk line. And if you're watching your corn field to decide when to harvest, a good rule of thumb would be around 0.5% per day dry down on that corn. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the chop length and kernel processing. So the theoretical length of cut, which they like to call, or they do call the TLC, is processed around the 3/4 inch. If the forage is not processed, then we could put that to about a 1/4 or a 1/2 inch. When the chop length is too coarse, it can become too difficult to pack, and then we see problems in the fermentation or spoilage down the road. Another really critical process is the kernel processing. So it unlocks, when we process those kernels, it's unlocking the energetic potential of the starch that's found in that corn kernel. During the kernel processing, the protective layer of the kernel is damaged and it exposes the starch to allow the microbial fermentation. If the silage is processed properly, there should be no whole kernels and no pieces of cob visible. So it's really important to be checking during the harvesting process so that changes can be made to the chopper if needed. And on this picture I've got on the screen there, that right side is what we're ideally looking for with each kernel being damaged in the processing. Later in this presentation, we're going to dig a little bit further into drought, but it's important to talk about drought when we're talking about inoculants. So drought-stressed corn is likely to be less healthy than a not drought-stressed corn plant. Thereby, we are increasing the opportunity for yeast or molds to infect that plant. Drought-stressed corn silage can also have a low grain content sometimes, so that causes higher than normal sugars and lower starch levels. Even after the fermentation process is completed, we can still see those results if it is drought-stressed. So these sugars will support the growth of various spoilage organisms to feed out, and they cause heating and shorter bunk life. Inoculants are something that we can use that can help the fermentation by reducing the pH, inhibiting yeast and mold growth. And this can extend our bunk life and when we feed during the warmer weather. The lactic acid producing bacteria inoculants have been selected for the ability to produce lactic acid, and they help speed up the fermentation process. And so that pickles that silage faster and it preserves more of the materials and the nutrients in that silage. When growers are buying inoculants, it's important that they examine those inoculants, all the claims that those inoculants have in the studies that are around them, to make sure that they are actually supporting the claims that they have, and also to follow the manufacturer's directions for storage and handling and application rates of that inoculant. So I'd like to talk a little bit later, hopefully during this discussion period, about different inoculants that you guys know of that are common for producers to be using. The objective of packing is to remove as much air as possible and create an anaerobic environment. So this means we're removing as much oxygen as possible so that bacteria can grow and carry out that fermentation process efficiently. So density is a way to gauge how well we packed that silage, and this measures the pounds of forage per cubic foot. Density depends on a number of factors, so the crop type, chop length, dry matter content, the type of structure, delivery rate, packing, and wait time. The average density for a bunker silos are around 40 to 50 pounds of fresh forage per cubic foot. And if the crop is harvested at 35% dry matter, this translates to roughly 14 to 16 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot. The weight of the tractor that's being used to pack this bunker pile and the amount of time that is being packed are very important to the final density. So as a rule of thumb, the packing tractor should run at least as many hours as the chopper. If it is being custom harvested, 2 packing tractors running at the same time might be needed, as the delivery rate of that chop material may be very quick. So you might need 2 tractors in that instance. Packing a 6-inch layer is going to result in a greater silage density than packing a 12-inch silage layer. All horizontal silos, so bunkers, trenches, or piles, should be covered in plastic as soon as possible after filling to exclude air and reduce any of the surface spoilage. The plastic should be anchored with dirt, tires, or any other heavy materials to prevent and protect it from wind damage. Sealing ensures that the anaerobic conditions are maintained by preventing the entrance of oxygen into the silage pile, and also keeps rain from infiltrating that pile and washing away some of those nutrients. The plastic films with a thickness of at least 4 mil are recommended because they offer more physical resistance, more resistance to any physical damage, and they prevent and slow down the infiltration of oxygen. The most common method to cover a silage pile is to put tires on top of it. But if you leave the tires in their normal form, it's going to collect some water, and then that makes it a great place for mosquitoes to form, and just is not a great place. So if you have the tires cut up, it makes it much better, reduces that risk, and that's just a better practice to do there. So this is very labor intensive, but the benefits are much greater because it's a well-preserved silage, and that's a really big investment, as we all know. And the ideal silage should be kept with the tires touching each other. So you can see that in that picture there, as well as the bacteria or the plastic covering up that silage. Harvesting drought damaged corn or immature corn as silage is not so different than when we are harvesting the mature corn. So all the same practices. We want to get it packed as soon as possible, no delays there, and have a protective covering over top of it to minimize losses. The proper moisture is very important for adequate fermentation, as we know. So the nutrient value of the silage from this immature corn, it really depends on the maturity. So it depends on if there was any ears there and how far they were developed. If it has no grain, the nutritional value is going to be reduced somewhat. However, if it does have some grain on there and it's still immature, the nutritional value is going to be similar to normal conditions and normal mature corn at silage harvest. Drought stress is a major limitation to forage yields. When drought has compromised the tonnage of corn grain, silage producers might still need to retain part of that feeding value. So of the water uptake by plants, approximately only 1% is retained for the metabolic processes. So the rest is used to move minerals from the roots to the stem during evaporative cooling. So during the dry periods and to reduce water losses through transpiration, plants respond by closing their stomata. And this mechanism saves water, but it also shuts off the evaporative cooling, which when combined with the environmental heat in higher foliage temperatures, it impairs the plant's metabolism. So slowing down of this metabolism of the processes allows that plant to save energy and nutrients to be used in the regrowth once the soil conditions improve. Producers can use silage for forage, and crop farmers can use drought stress silage to recover some of the costs of producing that crop. Drought stressed corn can be valuable, but there could be problems related to that use. So we're going to talk about a couple things to keep in mind. Because drought stressed corn has the potential to accumulate nitrates, nitrate toxicity of the animals is possible. So because the nitrate tends to accumulate in the lower portion of the stalks on drought stressed corn, raising the cutting bar to leave at least 1 foot of the stalk is what's the recommendation for drought stressed corn. In addition, the nitrogen oxide gas can build up during fermentation of drought stressed silage. So producers should take precautions when ensiling this drought stressed corn and when they're removing it for feeding. So a good idea is have it tested to make sure that there is none of that toxicity in the silage. Like so many parts of raising a crop, choosing your planting date for your corn silage is really variable depending on the year. So if possible, I would prefer that a grower is planting earlier in the year. When you plant earlier, you just increase the chance of having pollination completed before some of the hottest, most stressful days of summer. And it helps to plant in moist soil, but of course, always depends on the year and what kind of weather conditions we have. So you just have to use your best judgment when it comes to that. When you plant too shallow, it can cause really uneven emergence, and planting too deep can also cause an uneven emergence, even if you are starting to hit some of that moisture. So the recommended Iowa State planting depth is 1.5 to 2 inches. And I would say to follow that as closely as possible and to plant as early as possible as you can with the weather conditions. When selecting a hybrid, there's a couple things that we want to remember. So it's really best if you can choose a hybrid that has multiple purposes. So you want to choose a hybrid that has great silage traits, but also could be a good grain yielding hybrid as well, because you just don't know what that season is going to hold. So consider those both. And as corn silage since it is such a good energy source for livestock, there's 2 key variables that dairy producers should consider when picking their hybrid, and that is milk per acre and milk per ton. So there's a couple different evaluation systems that you can use online for that. And once you've identified the most suitable hybrid, select a hybrid, the hybrid group, select your hybrid based on the forage quality and your agronomic traits. Another big thing is talking with a livestock nutritionist to make sure that that hybrid is going to have the necessary nutritional value for your dairy cattle. The agronomic factors that you want to keep an eye out for are standability, dry down, and insect resistance, and also tolerance to drought and disease. So those are all really big ones when it comes to picking a hybrid for corn silage. Standability tends to be less important of these traits because you are harvesting earlier. So standability is really something we look for when that corn crop is going to be in the field all season long. So standability, you can probably give up that a little bit in order to make sure that you have really good dry down, drought tolerance, disease, and insect tolerance. Another thing is to stay away from any hybrids that have a really strong stay green. Avoid the stay green hybrids because that whole plant moisture is going to be too high when we want to be harvesting with the corn kernel moisture. So good idea to stay away from those stay green hybrids. If you have a longer season hybrid, that tends to be a little better for your silage hybrids, but usually maybe 5 days longer than your normal grain corn hybrid. But you just really want to find which one is optimal. And so you just got to weigh your pros and cons. If you find an earlier hybrid that is still good for grain production, you might want to go towards that versus a longer season. Now, if you're planting multiple hybrids, it's really good to be varying your day length for your hybrids. So if you need to be harvesting multiple fields, you know you can't get to them all in the same day. Make sure you space out your maturity so you can get to your fields in time when they are at the right moisture content. Now, there are specific companies that make hybrids specifically for silage. So I know like a BMR corn is one of those. So that's another option to look at. Just make sure you keep your options open. It's still got some good grain quality as well. But BMR is one specific silage hybrid that I do know of. So although corn, when it comes down to it, is going to be our #1 choice for forage for our dairy cattle, it's got the best nutritional value. I wanted to talk a little bit today about some alternative forages that we can use. And this always comes up in these drought seasons because sometimes we're looking for some other options when we know we're not going to have enough corn silage. So some are annuals, such as Sudan grass or millet, are some options for using sorghum as a forage. Also, teff grass would be an option. These forages can be used in the diets of the lactating cows or as forage sources for heifers or dry cows to increase the supply of the quality forage for the lactating cows. So you just have to take into account how much product, how much inventory you have, and disperse it as you see best for your herd. So although some effective fiber is necessary in a dairy cow's diet, some non-fiber feed sources would be soybean hulls, corn gelatin feed, cottonseed hulls, and wheat midds can help to meet that animal's fiber requirements while still maintaining the production and health. Some less expensive fiber options would be straw or a low quality hay. However, in drought years, hay crop forages are often high quality, but in limited supply. So if you're able to purchase a high quality hay crop, it's a good option if the milk prices are high and feed costs are reasonable. So again, this might allow you to maybe feed the higher quality to your lactating cows and just kind of move around that inventory as you see best on your farm. Another option is going to be purchasing corn silage from other local crop farmer. And this is advantageous for both the livestock producer to still have access to that corn silage and the crop farmer to have a good option to sell their corn as well. I talked a little bit about earlier or whatever about teff grass, and that is one that I'm hearing a lot of buzz about now, and that can work for a silage option. So it's fast growing, it's high yielding, and it's really good quality. And it tolerates drought, which is, the main thing we're looking at right now. One problem is it's very, very finicky when it comes to planting it. So it needs really warm soils. It needs really good seed to soil contact. So it can be hard to get established, but if it gets established should be a really good option. One good thing about the teff grass also is that it can survive a frost, and after frost, it does not accumulate any prussic acid. So that's another option or a good option when some of those other forages are questionable after a frost. All right, so I went through this all pretty quickly. At this time, I'd just like to hear if you guys have any questions or open the floor up for discussion on any of the points I hit on today. And like to hear maybe about some strategies that you guys know of that local dairy farmers use to combat the drought stresses that we had in this past growing season.
Thank you, Leah. Since we've got a real manageable group here, just go ahead and unmute if you've got a question, and we'll take it kind of live and direct.
I've got a question for you, Leah, if nobody else does. You had talked about planting early, and so there's always this balance between mudding stuff in. And so can you give some insight on what is too early and how to deal, because we're likely with all the snow, maybe to have maybe potentially a little later spring. So can you give us some insight on how do you tell when you should be planting from a soil moisture standpoint?
Right. So the biggest thing is that we don't want that corn plant in the ground to be imbibing too much cold water. So we really, I can't really throw out a date on the calendar just because we never know what that spring season is going to look like. So it's just looking ahead at the weather forecast. You don't be putting that seed in the ground if we know it's going to be taking in so much cold water. But it really is impressive in these last few years. I've been hearing some crazy early planting dates, and those corn hybrids are still making it up out of the ground. So some people are going as early as late March, they're putting that seed in the ground and still getting a good crop from it. Usually that April 15th is a date we like to throw out, but it's all going to depend on the weather conditions. If you see good growing conditions coming forward in the weather forecast, I wouldn't be afraid to get that corn in the ground.
Okay, you'd mentioned BMR. Are they gonna tolerate drought better, worse, or about the same? How do they stack up that way?
So I don't know the specific hybrids, but I would imagine it's going to be very similar to our normal corn hybrids where they're all going to have ratings. So you're going to have some BMR hybrids that are much better with drought and some that are not. So that's something that you're just going to have to talk with your seed dealer about. They're going to have key hybrids that are good in drought conditions, just like we do with any normal corn hybrid.
Hey, does anyone want to share what alternatives they've put into the ground during the last couple of drouthy years? Or Jim, what have you seen in your part of the world as far as not just corn going into the ground?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we're seeing obviously like everywhere, a lot more double cropping that actually works, or cover crops, whatever the term you want to use. And that of course works better in southern Minnesota and Iowa than it does in Minnesota. And when a couple of years ago, when it was really droughty, some of the things people try to plant is maybe some later brown midrib sorghum Sudan grass. I think you had mentioned teff, Leah. I think people are experimenting with that. The challenge with teff is you got to cut it really often. It grows really fast, so you got to cut it really often. But I think they're kind of looking around for crops like that and hoping that, when you still look at everything, and Leah talked a lot about it, it's hard to beat corn silage for tons. It's just darn hard, unless you think it's going to be really, really dry and then plant some of these other forages that maybe survive a little bit in drought. Heidi, you're more in that droughty area of South Dakota. What are these people planning, whether they're dairy or beef, if they just need some forages? The other thing we see, Fred, and I don't know if you have as many down there, people just cut everything they can find for forages. They cut meadows that haven't been cut for many, many years. They'll cut road ditches. They'll cut whatever I think they feed tree bark if you can get it, right? I mean, and then you feed it to the appropriate groups of animals. If you only got high milking cows, that doesn't work. But your pregnant heifers, feed corn stalks. That's the other thing people will be feeding if you get them up dry enough. So they look around for whatever they can find.
This year was really amazing that some of the tests on those rolled up corn stalk bales were wild, higher than I'd ever seen. So, they are an asset that maybe makes them worth that $95. Heidi, what else is out in South Dakota?
Pretty variable. Definitely some rye is going around. Still pretty traditional on the alfalfa for a lot of their forages. When it comes to the corn stalks, maybe more on the beef side. They'll use it probably for bedding unless they really get in a pinch. But our beef guys snatch it up way more than the dairy guys. Definitely some cover crop mixes going in, but it's still pretty minimal in terms of how to get that double crop that Jim was referring to. So I think this year is going to tell us a little bit more, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. Because like Jim said, there's definitely pockets of lots of snow, and it'll be interesting what planting dates happen and how spring goes.
Yeah, I think, Heidi, you make a good point. It's tricky planting cover crops after anything when it's so dry, because it's likely not to come up, right? I mean, Leah, you talked about it. If it goes in perfectly dry, so that's always a tough balance on what do you do? You're pulling off corn silage, so you want to get in there and plant something, but it's really dry. So I think that's a tough decision to make. If you've got money, you put in something like oats or whatever you can get in there that doesn't cost you too much, and you hope it grows. But that's a tricky balance.
Yesterday, Leah, or 2 days ago, we heard Dennis Toddy talk about, what's to look forward, in the climate. And it sounded like we still are going to have some drouthy season, or at least a big part of it. This question may be not fair, but I'm looking for the trigger point. I've got 7 inches less moisture in my soil profile. It doesn't look like we're going to have a lot of rain in the next 2 weeks. It's time to plant. When do I pull the trigger and go out and find some milo or sorghum to put in the ground as opposed to my traditional corn crop?
Yeah, I guess that's a pretty tricky question, and it's gonna really depend on, I feel like that those dairy producers that have these high quality lactating cows that they need to be feeding high quality corn silage are still just gonna have to do that. So I don't know when the trigger is. I think maybe if you have some options of feeding some of those alternative forages to other herds, then maybe that would be something to do. But I don't know. I think that gets kind of tricky. We don't want to be not planting our corn because of a forecast. I don't know, that it gets a little, it would make me a little nervous not to be planting that corn for silage.
That was
The
the
other
perfect answer.
The other thing I would encourage people to do, and it depends upon the density of livestock in your area, but if you've got some cash crop farmers that are around the area, I would encourage livestock producers to talk with them earlier than later. So you're planting it, it's going to be dry. You're thinking you're not going to get the tons you need. Talk to your neighbors that are cash crop farmers, because number one, they typically like to help out their neighbors. Number two, they just as soon get a fair price for that and sometimes harvest a stover off of that. So then some of that droughty stuff for them is not going to yield that well either. But you kind of need to have those discussions, probably not starting August 15th when you need to chop the next day. You've got to kind of agree on a price. So we see a lot of that over here. And sometimes the cash crop farmers come over and talk to the dairy farm neighbors and say, hey, my corn isn't really that good. You're going to have a short corn crop. The other thing is make sure in a good year you get adequate inventory. And I know that's hard, cost to store forage, but if you can store just a couple extra months, so if you're a little bit short, maybe then that year you can kind of eat into that inventory. So there's some of that around that inventory management and visiting with your neighbors and other people that might have forages that they might be willing to sell you.
Yeah, absolutely. I know in my area, in Plymouth County, we had quite a bit of that, dairy producers going to more cash crop growers than they had in the past because they really needed that tonnage.
Yeah. And that's a win for everybody, and that's what we want.
Yep.
As we are kind of winding up, anybody have any questions or want to share anything they've done with their dairy to kind of weather some of these drouthy years? Jim, I'll ask you this question. What's the most out of the usual pattern forage crop that you've seen go in the ground up there?
Now, it's a good question, Fred. I don't, these guys you see so many things with cover crops now, whether they feed it or not. And Heidi mentioned a lot of that tends to be a little bit more beef related, like the radishes and some of those crops that are going. I think we stay pretty traditional. Meadow fescue, triticale. People they'll plant rye, but not a lot of the dairy farmers will plant rye specifically because of some of the harvest issues. But those are kind of the crops. We'll see grasses. I mean, you're seeing a lot more grass than you used to. I think the most unusual thing again is harvesting these former swamps that are now, prairies kind of, or wetlands and whatever happens to be in there. You know, the thing to be a little bit worried about is if you end up purchasing a lot of forages from a ways away, just watch, you know, they seem to think, at least in Minnesota, that's where some of these noxious weeds like Palmer amaranth and some of those other, Leah, I am sure you can comment more on that. Some of these weeds that are coming in. And I think sometimes they believe, right or wrong, that potentially some imported feed from some of those areas are coming in, and of course those weed seeds then probably end up in the manure and get spread out. So I don't know, do you have any comments, Leah, on that purchasing feeds?
Yeah, so I guess I see more of the seed side of things versus purchasing it when it's harvested and being sold as feed. But I know on the seed side of things, there's always going to be a noxious seed percentage. It's always getting checked to make sure that there's not a higher percentage of noxious weeds in there. And so I'd be curious to know if they have to do those same checks on the feed before it goes to another place as well. Because that sure seems like something that we should be checking out before we are sending this feed stuffs all over.
It's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It
Yeah,
would be
I'm not.
something if I
Hey,
was
they
putting
sure
out my
don't.
farm,
I
would.
don't know. I don't know about grains, but hey, they sure don't. I don't know about cottonseed either. Some of those kind of products that might come in, if there are any testing requirements. I want to say no, but there might be other people on the call that are smarter than I am. That's for sure.
Yeah, because I think, you know, we're testing at that seed level. We probably want to, if we're really utilizing quite a bit of that, we probably want to be checking that out as well to make sure we don't have further problems.
I'm not seeing any other questions out there. Leah, give us maybe your parting message. You know, what do you want the folks on this webinar to take away and ponder, and then give you a call about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess through all my digging to pull this presentation together, I think at the end of the day, we want to be feeding this corn silage. And I guess my take home message would be kind of crazy these last couple of years, the amount of yield that we've been able to pull off with as little moisture as we have had. And I am feeling optimistic about the coming growing season that we can continue to pull off these yields if we can get just a little bit more rain. And I think this drought eventually will be something that we talk about. That was so crazy, those string of a few years. So I'm still optimistic, and I would still very much encourage growers to be planting their corn for their silage, for their dairy cattle. It's really good to be having these conversations about alternative forages, and maybe if there's a small way that you can implement those in your operation, but I wouldn't do a whole 180 at this time.
Jim, I think you and I both would agree that corn silage is the basis of rations in herds that are hitting that 100-pound a day mark. And we sure don't want to jeopardize that. Yeah, we can put some other components into the ration, but corn silage is still the queen of the forages.
Yeah, that's just the way it is. And we've got, Leah, you said we've got such good hybrids now. It blows my mind. They seem like they just kind of sit there, and if you get a little rain that's timed right, it's unbelievable to me and how good some of these hybrids are.
Yep, it's been shocking these last couple of years, but I think I'm optimistic about it.
So maybe, Leah, since you're a corn expert, are there good drought tolerant hybrids? I mean, let's just say it looks like it's droughty and people want to kind of spread their risk from a hybrid selection. I know a lot of farms probably have all their hybrids purchased already, but how much variation is there in drought tolerance among corn hybrids?
So there's absolutely different hybrids in how well they deal with drought. Different companies will call them by different names. So you just have to look into your specific company that you're buying from. They all have different verbiage on how they put that out there. But there's definitely different hybrids that are better or worse with that stress. And then there's also agronomic products that you can be putting on throughout the growing season that are also going to help with your plant stress. And that's just something you need to be running by with your agronomist. I saw something earlier that was saying to be a good dairyman, you need to make sure you're a good agronomist first. We need to be really taking care of that silage. So make sure you're taking priority with that silage during the growing season. Different products you can put out there to help your corn in that most stressful time of the growing season to ensure that pollination can be done correctly. We can't control the rain, of course. We would love for it to rain and lots of moisture during pollination, but there's things you can do to help your corn crop during the drought years, and starting with a good drought tolerant hybrid is a good idea.
Leah, go ahead. If we got somebody with a question coming on.
Well, not as much of a question as, I guess, more of a comment, I guess. I think the one thing that we're missing in this conversation is talking about soil health and increasing organic matter to help hold the moisture that we do get when we get it. I don't know, I don't remember what the exact number is, but I know there's a number out there that says for each % of organic matter you increase, it will hold so much more water in the soil. So the more that we can increase that, and I think, you know, there's some rotations that guys are using that are, you take your corn silage off, implement a cover crop, and I know I heard the discussion about, well, it's risky to put a cover crop in when it's dry. But you can take that, get that cover crop growing, and then implement. You could chop that off. You could kill it off early, plant your corn into it. Guys are doing both. The guys who chop it off and come back with a summer annual, they get the benefit of the summer annual. I'm even reading about some people that are looking at these summer annuals. If you start looking at tons of digestible dry matter per acre that are competing with corn silage for that same amount. So just something to think about as you're talking about drought stress.
John, as you were reading, what were some of the summer annuals that seem to pop up more often than not?
They're doing mixes of summer sorghum Sudan grass is always in the mix. Some people are doing throwing some Italian ryegrass in. Some other clovers maybe too. Those are just some different mixes that I've seen. But like, yeah, the BMR sorghum Sudan is still the base of the mixes that I've seen.
How often are they harvesting that, John? You make a lot of good points. So I'm just curious on those mixes, because we also need calf feed, even if it would get a little bit more mature. And if we can get something that's really good tonnage, because tonnage is always an issue.
Sure.
So you want to comment a little bit on kind of some of the harvest strategies, whether you know them or have read about?
So it depends. So I'm seeing guys chopping sorghum Sudan grass for the milking herd. They're getting that kind of quality out of it. So they're cutting it 45 days after seeding. I mean, depending on moisture, you know, what you get from moisture. I've seen some other guys that are taking, though they're using the photosensitive sorghum Sudan grass and just taking the one cutting, typically right around corn silage time. So it just depends on what variety you decide to grow, and what your goals are.
I know we've got folks from around the Central Plains here. John, would you mind sharing where you're located out of?
I'm up in the northeast Iowa area.
Great discussion. Any other comments? Leah, final comment?
No, other than just I really enjoyed today and I look forward to, I've only been in this role a few months, so I'm looking forward to getting to learn more about the dairy in Northwest Iowa specifically, but all across the state and just how you guys do what you do. So I'm excited to learn more.
Well, we thank you for the presentation today and would like to remind everybody that our next I-29 dairy webinar program will be February 6th, and it's calf care and quality assurance, new tools for calf raisers. We've got two of the professionals from the industry to speak with us. Again, that will be February 6th, and again at 12 noon. So thank you very much for attending. And with this, we will close the program.